All right. Welcome, everyone, to the next episode of our the community table training series presented by Anthem Medicaid. We want to thank our sponsor, Anthem Medicaid, for making this possible, for it being free and statewide, and also the capabilities of Zoom and allowing us to record it as well. Today we have with us Dr. Carey Addison. He's the leader of the Common Assessment Team here in Louisville, and he is going to discuss the new Louisville Common Assessment Tool. Dr. Carey, go ahead.
Thank you, Danielle. And my apologies, my laptop is being hostile towards Zoom, so my apologies, you can only see half my face, but I'll be sharing my presentation, so you won't have to look at that anyway. As Danielle said, I am Carey Addison, and since 2014, I have been leading the Common Assessment Team, which is contracted through Family Health Centers Phoenix. And over the past year, I've been working with a number of my colleagues on revising the Common Assessment Tool. So today, what I'm going to do is talk to you about how that process has worked and the product we come up with and our plans for implementing it very soon, starting next week, actually. Just some housekeeping. If you have questions, use the question and answer box. And at the end of the presentation, I'll try to get to everyone's question then, okay? Okay. So a little bit of background. Since we first started the Common Assessment Project in 2014, our goal was to prioritize households for permanent supportive housing and other COC programs like rapid rehousing, transitional housing. That's grown a lot over time. We work a lot with Louisville Metro Housing Authority now, with both public housing preferences, housing choice. We've really branched out. When we began the process, the tool that we used to prioritize people was pretty much recommended around the country. The tool was the VI-SPDAT. I think most of you here today are probably very familiar with that tool. It was developed by a Canadian agency called OrgCode. They came down to Louisville and did a presentation with all of the providers at that time, and we launched it. And we did over 10,000 of those assessments in the two versions. It was launched in a version 1 and then later in a shorter version 2 around 5 years ago. And we've used those to help guide our process of who gets referred to housing, and have done over 10,000 of them in that nearly 9 years, which is really hard for me to believe at this time. It's been very useful to us. The tool looks at vulnerability, as it said, who is most likely to die on the street, and did that in terms of street homelessness. So it really looked at the experiences of people who were living outdoors and tried to channel what things made them most vulnerable. We found over time, both here in Louisville and what we received, with national trends, is some elements of the assessment become to show as more problematic. Particularly, it's very long. Some of the questions are difficult to understand. Clients don't know what they mean. Sometimes the person asking them don't know what they mean. Responses can be hard to verify. Questions like, do you have meaningful activity, can mean a lot of things to other people. As clients got used to the tool, it became very easy for them to manipulate it if they knew what was going on. And also that the questions asked don't necessarily reflect the vulnerability of everyone that's unhoused. So populations like youth and young adults, LGBTQ, people of color and underrepresented communities, they may not be receiving those higher VI SPDAT scores that are likely to make them a higher priority for housing. The other thing I'll add that I found in that time is I work, within the parameters of what HUD dictates. A lot of programs require someone to be chronically homeless, but at the very least, we have to verify they're on the street. We have to verify they have a disability for a lot of programs, certain disabilities. So those things, dictated more who we could house than the score. So with all that information, we realized it was time to start looking for a new tool to use. So early last year in 2020, we began trying to chart a course on how to do that. We formed a committee of people on the Coordinated Entry Steering Committee, a subgroup to work with looking at new tools and develop one. HUD was also thinking similarly at that time, and they provided a technical assistance project that we participated in as well. And then, of course, we wanted a lot of feedback. We wanted to know what the partners, what the people we're working with and the people we serve, more importantly, think about what we're doing. So what did we find in the early part of that process? What we really wanted to find was a tool to say, oh, this is what we should use. It's perfect. There was no recommendation of that. There's nothing out there. HUD was saying you should migrate away from the VI SPDAT, but we didn't have anything out there. So we made the decision that we would develop our own assessment tool based on our experience, what we think is important, and what our providers and our consumers think we need, as well as the programs that we work with. So we began gathering input very early on, starting with a survey of service providers within the COC. So that includes outreach groups, that includes the shelters and day centers that serve people, and the housing providers themselves as well. What we found was that people actually liked what the VI SPDAT was getting at. They thought a lot of the criteria on there were important questions for understanding it. But like we said earlier, there was a lot of comment that it was, subjective, lengthy, easy to manipulate, and difficult to understand. A lot of feedback that it's not accessible enough. There's only usually 9 members of Common Assessment at a time out there trying to assess hundreds of people. So we knew we needed to look at how we could expand that, or even just by making it shorter, increasing our capacity to serve people. We began getting feedback from consumers. Something that I found interesting was that they didn't think that prioritizing Category 1 homeless was important as HUD does, or that I always have. I've always said if someone's in a shelter on the street, they're going to be the most vulnerable people. The feedback we got is more homeless is homeless. People that are staying with other people may be at greater risk because they're more likely to be engaging in activities like survival sex, or otherwise putting themselves or their families in harm's way to be in those situations. We got a lot of feedback that the homeless experience of young adults and youth were not considered enough. And that come from both consumers and providers. And the interesting thing for me on the consumer end was that it wasn't young adults saying that. It was people that were older adults that had, aged outside of that transitional age, saying that they were just seeing so many more younger people out there. And also that we just need a system for prioritizing people who we know are really vulnerable, but they didn't score very highly on the VI SPDAT. So think about things like medical vulnerability, like they're living with a chronic health condition or multiple conditions that make living on the street very dangerous for them. but they may not have been homeless very long. They may not have a substance use disorder. They may not have those other factors that have given people higher scores on the VIASP-ADAPT. So this feedback gave us some goals of what we wanted our new assessment tool to be. We realized one thing is we need to base the prioritization process on both the community needs and the feedback we got, but also the availability of the existing resources. We're using this tool to prioritize people for housing, primarily housing provided by the COC. So we do have to work within those guidelines. So really things like being chronically homeless, living with a severe mental illness, or living with HIV/AIDS, and all of those things set priorities to begin with. So I just wanted to be realistic and include that in our scheme. We wanted to create a quick and concise assessment tool. So we started looking at the questions that people liked about the VIASP-ADAPT, the things we wanted to keep. How could we word them differently? How could we make them more direct? We got a lot of feedback on things we weren't asking before, especially in regards to barriers to housing. I'll go through the tool with you all momentarily, and we can talk more about that. Of course, retaining the focus on vulnerability, but trying to use more objective questions, things that if we really feel like we're getting a lot of over-reporting about things, that we could verify, go back and verify them if we needed to. And then addressing areas that may not have applied equally for underrepresented populations. So again, thinking about young adults, thinking about people of color, thinking about LGBTQ, also thinking a lot about domestic violence victims and survivors, because we've seen a high influx of them. It felt like the pandemic really brought that issue to the forefront. Luckily, we've been able to garner more resources for that population, but we've just identified a huge need there that Common Assessment at least wasn't looking at closely enough beforehand. So developing the process and the tool, the committee and I came up with a set of questions. We began presenting those. I met with our medical provider staff at Phoenix that's very well versed in the conditions that people that are experiencing street homelessness may have. We were able to include those in the language. We drafted our priorities, like we said, who is most important to serve, and got their questions. And then we began going out and getting feedback on that. In the fall, I presented to the COC. We also presented to the Community Consulting Board, which is consumers, both homeless and formerly homeless individuals. We used their feedback to finalize the tool, and it was voted to be approved by the Coordinated Entry Steering Committee this winter. So our next tasks are to implement and administer the Common Assessment tool. My goal was January 2023. That passed us up, and then February was over before we knew it, but it's actually very timely that we're presenting today, because our rollout date is going to be this coming Monday, with March 6th. Staff will be trained tomorrow on it, and we'll be going out there. And then we're also continuing to work on some prioritization for some of those subpopulations that we mentioned earlier that we feel like need some extra consideration, prioritization points, because their situations may be different than the rest of our homeless population. So very quickly, we have a set of priorities for housing people, like I mentioned, that a lot of that fits in with the funding and the programs we have. Chronically homeless, several of our PSH grants are designated for chronically homeless individuals. Most of you are probably familiar with that term. If you're not, it essentially means you've had 12 months of homelessness, either consecutively or episodically within the last 3 years, and you're disabled. We work with agencies like Wellspring and House of Ruth that work with specific disability groups that have high vulnerability rates within our population. Families with children, of course, are important criteria, especially with our rapid rehousing programs, which are primarily oriented towards serving families. Youth and young adults, of course, we've had programming through the YHDP project and Home of the Innocents. We've carved out room for domestic violence victims and survivors, both through St. Vincent de Paul's program, which provides a transitional to rapid rehousing component, and also granting some preference within using resources allocated through the Housing Authority as well for preferences. 55 and disabled, we have a great partnership with LMHA Public Housing that is able to give persons that are unhoused the ability to basically skip the list if they're homeless and referred for us. So they're on a much shorter waiting list to get in if they meet that criteria. And then we looked at some groups that we thought were important for some of our resources that weren't as restricted. So that's like our non-chronic permanent supportive housing programs, that a person has to be homeless and disabled, but they may not have to meet that 12-month threshold. So we looked especially at the medically frail population, and also people that are long-term shelter stayers. So they've been homeless for 6 months or more, but they're not meeting that chronic homeless definition as well, is both a means for them. Also, we have some people in that category that don't have a disability, so they're never going to get permanent supportive housing. Looking at giving them preference to getting housing choice vouchers or public housing as well. So those priorities guide a lot of who gets housed. So they of course must fit in that. We have to have the documentation that shows they're eligible. That's a big part of what Common Assessment does post-assessment, is figure out, okay, we think this is what you may be eligible for. This is how these are the verifications and the documents we need to show that you do, to help advocate and build a case for getting their referrals. Clients may be considered for as many priorities as they demonstrate eligibility for. So that means a person may be chronically homeless, have a severe mental illness, and have HIV. Also, they could be considered for all of those priorities. Whenever someone is, that will rank them based on the score. So that's really where the score comes in. A lot of people think that's the most important part of Common Assessment, is the score. Yes, it's an important component, but showing someone is eligible for a program is first, and then the score just helps us rank who gets to move in from there. And we do sometimes, we're able to help people who fall outside of those categories. That's what our housing navigators, we have 2 staff members that help people apply for site-based Section 8 and other subsidized housing opportunities. So we know those priorities are going to be our prime area for housing people, but we are sometimes able to help people outside of them as well. Okay, so given all of that in mind and all of the feedback we received, I'm going to go through the tool with you all now so you can understand what we're asking, how people get points on it. The questionnaire used to be a separate assessment for individuals and families. We've moved to a uniform tool, and there's just some additional questions for families at the end. And some wording throughout the assessment that we can make it pertain to a household if there are multiple people in it, especially households with children. So we ask how old the head of household is, and preference can be given to both younger and older people. So 18 to 24-year-olds would score a point, or if a person was 55 or over, they would get a point. If there's a female in the household that's currently pregnant, that's another vulnerability point. We ask, has anyone in the household ever experienced any kind of domestic violence or other kind of physical, sexual, psychological, or other abuse or violence? We ask about time homeless. And this is kind of beyond the chronic homeless. So chronically homeless people get some preference anyway because there's so many programs for them. But we're also looking at people that have stayed out for 3 or more years as an additional point. or people that have been in shelter for that long for vulnerability as well. We kept a couple of the questions about service utilization from the VI-SPDAT. The ones we thought most were important were hospital, inpatient stays, or emergency room visits. We combined that from the old questionnaire that asked separately about ambulances, emergency room, and inpatient, and we lumped them together. I'm just seeing a typo that I have inpatient hospital stays. I get inpatient in the hospital, but that should be inpatient. And we also made it a little bit more lenient. In the past, it was based on the past 6 months. We expanded that to a year. And we did the same thing with arrest and incarcerations as well. We combined those two questions and expanded it to a year. And if there were 4 or more incidents of that happening, a point would be earned there as well. We've asked about legal status in the past, but something that we have found that's really important is the sex offender registry makes people extremely vulnerable because there are so few opportunities to serve them. We are fortunate that some of our COC programs are able to, but not all. So we definitely included that in there, with as well as any other legal status like being on parole or probation, because people that are street homeless are often at jeopardy of going back to jail because they're not meeting their probation requirements by not having a place to stay. The input that we received also led us to add a sub-question about veteran status as well. We have a lot of veterans that we work with that are not eligible for VA HUD-VASH programs or VOA SSVF because they have a dishonorable discharge or some other thing that was perhaps traumatic or linked to their vulnerability that keep them from accessing housing. So we added a second part about having any legal issues or discharge that would prevent them from accessing the veterans resources they would otherwise be able to use. The medical conditions, like I said, we always have really tried to look at medical vulnerability. Before the VI-SPDAT, even before then, there was a vulnerability index that looked very specifically at things. And with each version of this SPDAT tool, it got watered down a little bit more. So we wanted to return to that. And that was part of the reason I spent a lot of time consulting with medical providers about what conditions they saw that were the most dangerous. And we came up with the following. Severe liver disease, stage 3 or 4, severe kidney disease, heart disease as in heart failure or vascular disease, COPD, HIV or AIDS, or another autoimmune disease like lupus, fibromyalgia, rheumatoid arthritis, or MS, and then cancer as well. So that's not a collective number of points. You don't get a point for each one of them, but if you have at least one, you get a point. If you have all of them, you still get that same point. And then another area that we wanted to add for medical vulnerability is a lot of people have medical conditions that require certain forms of assistance, or they have certain things that it's very difficult to maintain if you live in a homeless camp or you live in a shelter. So the things we've seen over the years and our medical providers identified as needs is anyone that's a wheelchair or walker user, of course, people that require oxygen. That's been a big issue, is being able to make that work for people to go into shelter that are oxygen dependent. Insulin that requires refrigeration for diabetic care. Having a colostomy bag that needs to be regularly changed and cleaned, having the need for in-home health care to help with ADLs like bathing, getting dressed, getting food, preparing food. Of course, a caregiver can't do those things when you don't have a place to live. People currently going through chemotherapy treatments, kidney dialysis, people that are have a CPAP machine to treat sleep apnea, very difficult to use and have clean water for in an encampment where you don't have electricity or running water. And then accommodations for people who are visually or hearing impaired as well to have in their home as well. So again, any or all of those things would be 1 point as well added to their total score. We ask about having a cognitive or memory disorder. So really looking at things like dementia or traumatic brain injuries. And another thing I failed to mention earlier that we brought back from older versions of the tool, you'll see there's some opportunities here for surveyors to weigh in if they observe something. So it's very logical if someone, has this kind of cognitive impairment, they may not recognize it. So there's an opportunity for the surveyor to note that as well. That was in older versions of the VI SPDAT, but not the current. We ask about substance use disorder. We looked at some of the most risky behaviors and consequences of substance use. So people who have been in treatment as a signifier of a severe substance use disorder, as well as, if they've successfully completed treatment as housing as a tool to help them maintain their recovery. People that use needles to inject drugs, daily use of alcohol or illegal drugs, having had an overdose that required a medical intervention, so having to be Narcaned from opioid use primarily, being kicked out of a place you were staying due to a drug or alcohol problem as well. And again, we added an observation question as well. So things like someone openly denies substance use, but you can see they have needle marks on their arms, or it's 10 o'clock in the morning and you smell alcohol on their breath and their speech is slurred. Things like that to note, give us an opportunity to note as well if a client is not willing or aware of sharing those things. For a mental health disorder, we looked at severe and persistent mental illness, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder, PTSD, major depressive disorder. A lot of this was kind of guided by the criteria we use and Wellspring uses to determine severe and persistent mental illness and what we commonly see. So someone may be experiencing situational anxiety or depression, especially if they're homeless, but that's not the same as a chronic mental health condition that they're living with. So these questions are designed to distinguish from that. Again, there's an observational question in there. So for example, if someone is having some very delusional thoughts, they're having a conversation with someone else and there's no one else in the room during that time, but they don't indicate they have a mental illness, there's an opportunity for the surveyor to make note of that in there as well. We ask about hospitalization and treatment for mental health conditions as another measure of the severity of having a psychiatric condition. Like I said earlier, we wanted to look at housing barriers. One thing that came up is we have people, especially that have income, they may be remaining unhoused because they have outstanding debt to a previous landlord, which could include the housing authority. We see that as a lot as well, or a utility company, or something like that is keeping them from being able to be housed. So having an adverse housing history is itself as a vulnerability to homelessness, and we added as a question. We got a lot of feedback about including LGBTQ status, and we cannot give, from a fair housing perspective, we cannot give a point just because someone identifies as LGBTQ, but we can look at the vulnerabilities that are associated with that. And that led us to come up with a question. Have you ever been harassed, attacked, beaten up, or discriminated against where you were staying because of your sexual orientation or gender identity? So that pertains to things like if you were kicked out of your home, especially for young adults, or if you were in a shelter program and maybe they didn't let you stay because you're a transgender male and they wanted you to stay in the female program, even though you don't identify as a woman. So that is a vulnerability point. And then finally asking about basically survival sex, exchanging sex for food, drugs, money, or a place to sleep. Something, we unfortunately see a lot of. And those individuals often don't fall into the chronically homeless category because they've been engaging in those behaviors so they can stay off the street. So we added that point in there to recognize that experience, and they may not be getting prioritized otherwise. So we also, like I said, that's our standard questionnaire. If you were a single adult over the age of 24, those are the questions that you would be asked. However, like I said, we realize that there's some subpopulations that aren't as well reflected in there. So we're working on developing additional ways for them to get points. All the ones in red we're still working on. Families with children, we do have that in there. It's basically 4 additional questions, so there's up to 4 extra points that they can have that I'll go through with in just a moment. But I have 2 subgroups I'm currently working with. One of people experienced in domestic violence, to add a sub-assessment for them. So if someone identifies as being a victim of domestic violence, we'll ask those additional questions. And then also for youth and young adults as well, questions that may be relevant to their experience that we're not considering. Also from an equity standpoint, we're developing a means of helping reflect the vulnerability and elevate the prioritization of people who have not been represented, especially in communities of color that may not readily have access to the services downtown, or face a lot of barriers in housing, especially in the neighborhoods they live. So we're working to integrate with HMIS to give some priority for people who come from a high eviction zip code. Currently, the top 5 highest, I believe, are 40214, 40218, 40219, 40216, and 40211. If you look at a map, that primarily reflects both south and western parts of Louisville and the metropolitan area. Areas that you'll also not find a lot of homeless providers. So they may not be engaging as much with outreach workers, or going to St. John's Center, or going to the shelter, and they're following through the cracks. So that won't be a question that we ask, but we're hoping to add that as some sub points as well for our people that we assess. The family supplement. So real quick, if the head of household answered the first 16 questions, but they have children under the age of 18, they would be asked 4 additional questions. And we talked a lot with family providers about what made our families vulnerable. We found single parent households with 1 adult, and also households where grandparents or other relatives have custody of the children. Can be difficult because in both situations, it can be really difficult to work full time. If there's one person leading the household, or it's an older or disabled adult that are not the biological parents of the children working with them. Also, large families. Does the household have more than 3 children under the age of 18? The bigger the family, the harder it is to afford housing. We encounter families that will have 5, 6, 7 children. And the reality of our housing market is, even if 1 or 2 parents were working full time at average wage jobs, they would still be housing poor because they cannot afford a unit large enough. Children with disabilities, especially those that require around the clock care, or someone being there with them. So like if a child can't attend school or something that keeps their parent from being able to work, or adversely is affecting their health by being homeless. For example, if a child is very immunocompromised, being in a shelter with 100 other children is not conducive to them staying healthy. And then involvement with basically legal involvement, such like CPS involvement, family court or custody issues. This is a huge vulnerability for families. A lot of them run the risk of losing their children because they are not stably housed. And it creates a real chicken and egg problem because it's also hard to get a lot of families into the appropriate housing to reunify their family if they don't have that legal status. So there's a lot of barriers there, and we chose that as an area for prioritization as well. And then the medically vulnerable preference that I mentioned earlier, like I said, we've given some points for having extreme medical vulnerabilities, but we realize we have a lot of people, especially older individuals, who are very unwell. They have multiple chronic conditions, but they may be newly homeless. They may be homeless because of their medical condition. They may have been, newly diagnosed with that, and they're no longer able to work or maintain housing on their own. But they don't have the behavioral health issues or the history of homelessness that would make them rank highly on the assessment like other individuals that they're essentially competing with. And we realized there was a need for that. So we developed some criteria to help guide medical professionals in advocating for their clients. And we actually created a template letter, basically identifying that a person has a severe medical need and why that need makes them very vulnerable if they're unhoused, why being in a homeless shelter or on the street puts them specifically at risk, and what opportunities housing and case management can provide to help make that better, to increase their access to health care, to allow them to take their medications like they're prescribed. It's basically a means of advocacy. And then that provider can submit the letter to Common Assessment. And we have a subcommittee called Special Circumstances Committee who reviews declined referrals and other special situations that will review that letter and vote on whether that preference is legitimate. And if they approve that, basically that individual moves to the top of the list for any housing that they're eligible for. So if they're not chronically homeless, they're still not going to get a chronic opening. But for any non-chronic spots or anything else they're eligible for, they would be able to get a move to the top of the list for that. If we have multiple people, then we'll go again by who has the highest score at the top of that list. So far, we have done it for 2 individuals we've been able to get approval for, and I can say there are people that would not have normally rose to the top of the list due to various aspects of their situations as well. So I just think it's a really important thing for us to realize and accommodate is we can build the best tool in the world and there's still going to be people that fall through the cracks of it. So having processes in place to reflect that is something that's really important to us. So that is the process we use to develop our tool and the product that we came up with. Our next steps, like I said, this was a great time because we are developed the tool and integrated it, and we plan to have it up and running next week. So if you hear your clients being assessed, you'll know you may hear the questions being a little bit different. We'll continue to develop the young adult and DV assessment tools. I have group meetings on my calendar for the middle of March with groups that are both familiar working with those populations to help us choose those. And then again, we'll have the steering committee vote to approve to add those. We're also going to start vetting and training community partners to administer the assessment to make it more accessible for hard to reach populations. It's not something we want to grant just anyone the opportunity to do, but because the more people assess, the more opportunities for the assessment to be administered differently, for responses to be manipulated. But we also know, especially for young adults, that it's really hard to reach. And if we have people that are familiar with them and can do that, then we should take advantage of that resource. So essentially, we'll be vetting this tool and trying it out now and making sure there are no hiccups, fine-tuning it if needed. And later in the spring, we're going to start taking on, if someone is interested in doing that, they can apply. I developed a form that's a simple application where someone would list what their organization is, who they serve, why they would be a good fit to do the assessment. So why is their population having a difficult time reaching us otherwise? Who on their staff would be doing it? How many people? That they agree to participate in training, that they agree to maintain the data quality that we have to have for HMIS, things like that, to do it. And then the steering committee would vote to approve those applications if that partner would be added on or not. So, I want to roll through that slowly and make sure we're doing it the correct way, but hopefully later this spring, that'll be an opportunity as well. And then we know, just like the VI-SPDAT, we need to evaluate it. This is not a tool that's been tested in other communities. It's ours. We know it's not perfect, but we do feel like it reflects the values of both our providers and clients here in Louisville, as well as the resources we have. So we'll be looking at things like, is the time it takes to administer accurate? What's the variation in scores? We inevitably assess people multiple times. So looking to see if someone was assessed last year under the VI-SPDAT, is there a big fluctuation in their score? Do we think that's important? And if there's any changes in the demographics and vulnerabilities of those people referred as well. So are those being referred to permanent supportive housing under the new tool more reflective of a more diverse population than the older tool we use? Things like that. Like I said, we just, we know it won't be perfect, but we want to have the best tool that we can. So that is all that I have to present. I'm happy to use the remainder of our time to take questions and answers. Opening the open question box now, I don't see any. So you can type them in. Danielle, are people able to also just raise their hand and
I think
give them out as
so.
well?
They should be able to. There is one question in the chat from
Okay.
Sarah that says, can you send out the new VI-SPDAT so our staff can review it and become familiar with it?
Yes, absolutely, Sarah. Just so, and I've worked with a lot of agencies. Yeah, we're happy to share it, just so it doesn't become a training tool for clients as well. That's the only ask I have. I know we've had some providers in the past that use getting familiar with the tool as an opportunity to coach their clients.
Sorry, I put together Carey and Sarah. Sarah just said, thanks more so for my PSH team to understand how people are being referred to us. And then Mindy Waters said, if our agency is interested in applying to be able to complete assessments, how do we apply?
We have an application. You can ask. We're not quite ready at this point, Mindy, to do that, but like I said, we will. The big things that we ask is like why your agency should be considered to do that. Is common assessment not reaching them, basically? And then, like I said, just to agree to participate. So we'll hopefully announce that as we get some more experience with the tool. I also see Sarah has a very good question. What happens to the old assessment? Will you reassess everyone? No need to worry. We will be honoring the old scores. They'll slowly roll over just like they have in the past. So if someone has not been assessed in a year, they can be reassessed. So there's no need to rush and tell everyone to do the assessment again. Same as before, if you've been assessed in the last year, you're not eligible to be reassessed again until next year. I will honor the high score. We've always done that. The older VI SPDAT gave some people higher scores because there were more points on it. Part of the reason I went with 16 and 20 questions was it's very translatable to the old score, so that I know it's not comparing apples to apples, but comparing an apple to orange is not, the worst thing. We don't want to kick people out of the pool because of it. So yeah, we'll slowly roll over from the older tool to the new one. And like I said, the scores themselves are important, but they're not the most important thing. It's really that people fit in those criteria and that we're able to document them. And then the assessment itself is almost a tiebreaker from there. Like I said, our non-chronically homeless PSH projects have been the biggest exception, and we really refined some of our priorities there. So we're honing in on people that are medically vulnerable, people that have been in a shelter for a long time and they're not moving on, and fall in those types of situations.
Thank you, Carey. Can you also clarify with everyone with the new VI SPDAT the process for the exceptions committee or medical? Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, the special circumstances.
Thank you.
Yeah, so it was designed, I work as part of Phoenix Health Center. So we are very well integrated into our Healthcare for the Homeless project. And I have doctors and nurse practitioners and other people on our staff advocate all the time. And I also have people from outside the family health center system as well. And I think they truly know that those individuals, like I said, they have high medical vulnerabilities. They require oxygen to live. And, it's very hard to be on oxygen if you are in a shelter, or even harder if you're on the street. So in those cases, it is the provider that would write the letter. We have a statement prepared. We don't want to advertise very heavily that's not a letter we're going to give out to every client to take along with them. It's more of a chance for those providers to formalize the advocacy they've been doing. They prepare that letter. Like I said, we wrote out a template of kind of what they could follow. The big thing is that they identify the person has a condition that makes them severely vulnerable, and that housing is a key, to improving that with the help of permanent supportive housing, having case management services. That letter goes to me, and I present it to what we call our Special Circumstances Committee. It's a group of usually 4 people other than myself that vote. I would only vote as a tiebreaker. And also we recuse someone if they are the person advocating for the client. So for example, Mary Luke Noonan's a part of that committee from St. John. So if it's a St. John Center client, Mary Luke would not be included in the deliberation. Or Tamara Rife from VOA is part of that committee. So if it's a family staying at VOA, we would not include them. Basically, that group of individuals votes to prove it. In both instances we've had already, it was very easy to make that deliberation to approve the person that was had submitted for that medical vulnerability. We can use that as well. Like I said, we really wanted to emphasize medical vulnerability, but if there are other things going on with the person, especially like people that have developmental disabilities that may not be fully reflected, their vulnerability in there, we can take those into account as well. Basically, anyone that doesn't kind of fall in within that catch-all of like who's going to get referred, or people that score really low can be considered with that group. We just don't want people to take advantage of it, I guess you would say, because if we get too many, we'll flood it, and then basically it becomes a useless process. If we get hundreds of people that get special exceptions, they're no longer a special exception. I'll put it that way.
Thank you, Carey. Do we have any other questions for Carey? If so, just place them in the chat. Oh, Sarah.
Yes. So Sarah, we the committee talked about what we would call the assessment, and we decided that we're already known as the CAT, the Common Assessment Team, and our tool would be the Common Assessment Tool. So we've named it the Louisville Common Assessment Tool, and I think our acronym is going to quickly become the LouCat.
That's a great name, Carey.
Yeah.
I like the acronym.
I know, we're addicted to them.
Yeah.
Originally, I just was calling it the CAT, but then I realized that was somewhat confusing because it is also the team reference as well. So I think, and it is a tool that's unique to Louisville, and I'm proud of that we all provided input to help us develop it. So I think having the name of our community in it as well, I hope will stick.
Yeah, you did a wonderful job. All right. So one last chance for questions. Anybody else have any questions? Just place them in the chat. If not, or raise your hand. If not, we will, oh, we have one person with their hand raised. It was Sarah. Sarah, do you have more questions?
No.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much, Carey, for presenting today, and for you and the committee, the hard work that you all put into this. And we are excited to hear the feedback of when it gets started. And maybe, next year, after a year of doing it, we can do a presentation on your results and trends and how it's working. So thank you for your time. Thank you again to Anthem Medicaid, our sponsor for this training series. And thank you to everyone who attended today. And thank you everyone for your questions. We hope you have a wonderful rest of your week. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to all of you today.
Thank you. Bye.